is thumbnails, comps, panels, and splash pages. So how many do we have here that are interested in comics and graphic novels? Woo! All right. Is there anybody that's not?
Me.
No.
That's why I'm leaving.
Okay. Well, you should stay anyway because there's some cool stuff here. Do you like Batman?
Nope.
So I'm going to show you some of my personal projects that I've worked on. I've been working for myself for just over 10 years now. Before that, I did some graphic design for Coldwell Banker commercial. I make a lot more working for myself, over 3 times more actually than when I was working at Coldwell. So when people tell you you're going to be a starving artist or you're not going to make any money, prove them wrong, is my advice. Hales Art is my company. I do illustration and graphic design, like I said, full time. I've illustrated some comics. I started when I was 4. This is a He-Man. This is a Wolverine here I did last year. Wolverine. These were kind of for fun, but also sort of commissions. Friends, were getting me to do my rendition of these famous characters that we all love. Here's my 4-year-old Superman with an A on his chest. Curious. I'm not quite sure what I was thinking about that. The stars might give a hint. This is a Supergirl that I did this a couple years ago. Sort of a mirror of Henry Cavill's costume there. And then we have Raphael here, my take on him. I did a panel on character and creature creation, but today at this panel we're going to focus a little bit more on the layout of a comic page. And I'm going to talk about all the different kinds of comic layouts and also ideas for possibly doing stuff that's sort of breaking the boundaries, maybe getting us to think outside the box of what's already been done and what's being done by the big 4, Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse, Top Cow is another big one. And so I'm going to start out by talking about basically just sequential art. Obviously this is a storyboard. This is a storyboard I did for a real estate company a few years ago. List Zero, they're a lot like Zillow. They list real estate and stuff. They hired me to do a series of commercials. And the reason I show these storyboards is, storyboard kind of, the layout is pretty much done for you, right? It's pretty boring. All of the squares are exactly the same. It's basically just to inform the film crew, the production crew, the actors, what's going to take place, and it just gets everybody on the same page, right? And so storyboards are invaluable to a film production crew because, like I said, it just gets everybody thinking and visualizing what the end product's going to be. And so all you really need to know when you're doing storyboard work is where to put the camera, how to compose the shots, and lay out the individual pictures. You don't actually have to think about how to lay out the panels or the cells. So here's just a few examples. This is the second half of the commercial. For the first one, it's kind of just a kind of cheesy, kitschy, funny kind of theme here. A bunch of women in a cycling class. This is a couple in their bed just talking about listing their house. You can kind of see just some of the different angles. We've all seen commercials like this, right? But you just really have to work out, the camera angles, like I said, and the composition of the frame. When you say thumbnails, comps, panels, and splash pages, comp is just kind of shorthand for comprehensive or composition. It's basically just a planning stage. It's kind of a rough sketch. A thumbnail is basically the same thing, it's just smaller. And so generally when I get a script, I'll sort of break down, how many panels, what panel am I going to make the biggest, which one's going to have the most real estate on the page. And I'll sort of kind of block that out with a little thumbnail sketch. I might put some little stick figure characters and kind of figure that stuff out. I'm going to show us a couple examples of some more detailed thumbnails, as well as some comps. But here you can see kind of the line art here I did for a children's book that I did last year called Skeleton Play. A bunch of skeletons intermingling with people in Times Square. But I just wanted to show the difference between the comp or the line work in comics. It's called penciling, inking, and then color. You can see here the inks with the color. Here I have all 3 stages. So on the far right you can see the penciling stage. That would be considered a comp, and then you have your inker and then your colorist. On this particular book I was all 3, but and then there's the finish. So you can kind of see how that works. Alright, so here's a cover. This was a children's book I actually did for my twins. It was kind of a personal project. My wife and I had conjoined twins 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and I just did this little children's book as a tribute to them. But this kind of gives you an idea of, when you're talking about laying pages out, you can be talking about a children's book, you can be talking about a novel, you can be talking about a comic, graphic novel. It doesn't matter, the same rules and ideas still apply. Yeah?
Did you do these traditionally or digitally?
Yeah, move back to this one. I obviously drew these traditionally. Oops. Right there. Okay, so basically my style is to draw it traditionally, then I still have an artifact, right, when it's done, my original drawing, but I paint digitally. I used to, in college I did acrylics and oils. It's just so much more time intensive. And honestly, if you go to the bookstore and you look at all the paintings on the book covers, 95% digital. And it's because of the quick turnaround.
Do you scan the drawing in?
I do. And then I clean it up in Photoshop, and then, before I start painting, so.
Which software do you use?
I use the Adobe Creative Suite, because it's pretty seamless between design, illustration, you can do the vector with logos and things like that in Illustrator. So yeah, I just use Adobe Creative Suite. Basically is Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, and then you can have add-on programs as well. This is Hellboy. So I didn't do this, but this is a good example of a thumbnail. I'm actually not quite sure the original size of this, but you can kind of see the texture of the page, which tells me that it's very small. So this is a great example of a thumbnail. This is just a quick sketch that he kind of worked out, the composition, the camera angle, where the characters are, the horizon lines, that sort of thing. Big background elements, but you don't go into details. You don't really see, eyes and ears and that sort of thing. Here's another example of this is more of a comp. It's not as small. You can see this takes up the full page. This is a 2-page spread. So 2 comic pages. You have the one image, takes up the spread, but then you have these individual images. And you always have to be careful of the gutter line, which is going to cut this one in half. Because a lot of times when you're reading a book, if you're not looking at this on Comixology digitally, you're going to lose some of this image in the crease of the book. So you really have to be careful when we're doing a spread image that's going to get cut in half. So this is one that I did do. I just finished a spy novel last year. It's fully illustrated. It's called Blink. And these were the opening pages. I originally was going to do Blink as a graphic novel. And I changed my mind as I was working on these comps, actually, for the story. I wrote the script for the first section, or issue 1 of the graphic novel, and I decided that Blink needed to be a novel. There are certain strengths that comics have, there are certain strengths that film has, and there are certain strengths that novels have. Novels have the inner dialogue of your characters. You can really flesh out the history and the world building and what this character's gone through or going through. And you really get to know the characters better than you really can in a comic or a graphic novel. You're spending more time with that character in a novel. And I also found that people's favorite pages in a comic are the splash pages, or the pictures that take up the whole page. And so with Blink, I decided to transition. So here you have the first page, there's the second page. This is one of the opening scenes in Blink. But like I said, I decided to go a different route and do Blink as an illustrated novel. And I think we're gonna, with the ebooks, I think we're gonna see more and more of these. You know, you start to get audio files, you know, that pop up in the middle of your ebook. You're gonna see more image files. You're gonna see more video files, I think, as the future approaches. This is one of the early concepts I did of Blink's character, where I designed her armor. And this was for the comic, so this is what she was going to look like for the graphic novel. When I decided to write it as a 400-page novel, I decided it needed to be a little more realistic. And also, my wife was a model for this one. She has very petite features, kind of a sharp, pointy nose. She doesn't really look like she could take a punch. And so I wanted more of a, you know, Daniel Craig, but female look. And so I went with this model instead. And that's, this was sort of an intermediary cover. This was going to be the cover, but I wasn't quite satisfied with it. And so I ended with this, which is ultimately the cover I went with for Blink. So I'll just show you real quick a few of the illustrations. This is Blink over Barcelona. The same opening scene that you saw those sketches for in the comps. We have Agent Sail. Blink fighting, surfing, bad guy, jetpacks. There's a lot of political intrigue. The villain in Blink is the International Central Bank. So Blink is a champion for going against the system, or, you know, the man behind the curtain, the people that don't exist but actually control everything, the ones with all the money. Alright, so I'm just going to rush through these. These are what you would consider splash pages if they were in a comic, just full-page illustrations in a book, obviously. So in Blink, there's a couple of illustrations, also some character concepts for each chapter of the book. It's fun to play with architecture. I wanted a scene, and there's this really intense conversation between two of the bad guys. You can see the bad guys over here having a conversation over dinner, and they're the only ones in the restaurant. One of the guys owns the restaurant, and the guy that owns the restaurant wants to make the other guy very uncomfortable. And so in the image, I have him basically sitting between pillars of fire and sharks, right? And so there's fun little things you can do in your setting or your environment to help your storytelling. You know, he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, between pillars of fire and sharks. They have this waiter bringing them their next course. There's Blink flying through the sky. This is the big secret conference at the end. I'm not sure why these are in my comic panel, but these are some Book of Mormon scenes that I painted. Okay, more comic characters. I'm just going to rush through these so we can spend more time with layout. This was just a series of characters I designed for Berg Pediatric Dentistry. Originally, Muller Man was their only character, and I came up with all these others. Now they have over a dozen or so. Okay, this isn't me, obviously. This is Superman. One of the cool things about comics and laying out panels, are you guys all kind of clear on the difference between a thumbnail, a comprehensive, or a composition, a panel, and a splash page? Is there anybody that has any questions about that? I'm going to talk a little bit more about it as I go through these, but I just want to make sure everybody's clear. With comics, don't limit yourself to squares or rectangles. I'm going to show some really cool examples of thinking outside the box. Here Superman is coming out of the box, right? When people say a character is jumping off the page, I think that expression actually does come from comics. When people, actually jump off the page. Did any of you get the Blu-ray of Ghostbusters, the new Ghostbusters that just came out last year? Did you notice in some of the scenes the characters would come outside of the widescreen black bars? Did any of you notice that? Yeah, I think that's a little experimental thing that they're doing. For me, it bugged me a little bit. It kind of took me out, broke the fourth wall. But yeah, you can do that in your comics, and I don't think many people will object. I think we can all agree that that makes this a little bit more dynamic. All right. And I also wanted to just show a few different styles. You know, obviously different artists have different styles. There's nothing wrong with, you know, simplifying your characters or the overall look and style of your comic. Both of these work. You know, you have the more realistic, you have the more stylized, cartoony, blocky. You know, nobody has a jaw like that, a jawline. But we all love Batman the Animated Series, right? All right, who's this? Who illustrated this? Who penciled it? Yeah, Jim Lee, legend. This guy was inspiring to a lot of artists, especially his run of Uncanny X-Men in the '90s, which this is an example of. You had a lot of comic artists, you know, following that style after Jim Lee here. But you can see when you're laying out a comic page, you have to decide, you know, what's going to take up the most space, what's most important, what's of primary importance. And obviously they're all looking at something, and so there's some tension there. And you also have a lot of characters, so obviously that kind of needs to take up a lot of space, or they'd be too small to see. And then you have these smaller panels on the right where there's something happening. There's a transformation taking place. And so generally when there's a transformation of some kind, the panels will be fairly similar. So it's not jarring, you know, you're not trying to figure out what's happening. It'll just be kind of like bam, 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 you know, that there's this change or progression taking place. And that's just so as not to confuse your viewer, your reader. This is an example I put in here as a little bit of a bad example, just because there's so much text on the page. You look at this page and you kind of think, that's going to be a chore to read. One of the rolling rules in comics is to limit yourself to 3 dialogue bubbles per panel. I think it was said in the conference here, something like 230 or 250 word limit. The reason is a comic page is not that big. You have about 7 inches by about 10.5 inches. And you know, you cram too much text on there, and like I said, it becomes more of a chore because your font size is going to be a lot smaller, and your reader's going to have to work a lot harder to get what's going on and get what's being said. And you can't get the action and the response in as much detail. This is an example of one of my comics, Continuum. This is the one that was optioned by New Line Cinema in 2012. They actually sent me a rough outline of the script before it was written and wanted me to do 4 different covers. And so I actually illustrated these covers not knowing the story. But this is the first page of Continuum. And I thought it was brilliant. Steve Snyder out of LA wrote this. And you know, based on the script, he basically said each panel's going to look the same. I didn't want to just use the same image for each one, so I actually drew it a little variation in each one. But you can see with the placement of the moon and you know how zoomed in we are and everything, there's kind of a change, but it's also the same. So there's a continuum, you know, which is the title of the story, you know, to the layout. And you just have like I said, the lizard's in the same place for the first 3 panels, and then in the last panel something happens and it runs away. And so you can use little tricks like this, which really kind of help add tension or help tell the story as to what's going on. And also, it's fun to do little, you know, with your pacing as you're kind of laying out your story. You have a lot of like little kind of crazy things happening, and then you turn the page and it's a 2-page spread. And a lot of times the spread or the 2-page or the splash page or the 2-page spread is kind of a big reveal. So those can be a lot of fun. And then you introduce your characters. This is one where a lot of characters are having a conversation together. And so I thought that was the one that needed to take up the most space, you know, as they're getting out of this ship they've been stuck in for 5 years. And they're all stretching and they're actually able to breathe. You know, so I sort of reflected that with the size of that panel. Also, you can take up more space with kind of big emotional cliffhangers. You can see there's a close-up on the face down here because he says something very important. If the panel is small, then we don't place as much importance on it. Generally, it's good to have a cliffhanger at the end of every page. That makes your reader want to keep reading instead of going to bed. You want to keep them up all night. You don't want anybody to get any sleep that reads your books. There are also times to break the rules. You know, when I said there shouldn't be more than 3 dialogue bubbles on a page, you know, I break that rule all the time. But I'm aware of the rule and I know why it exists. So it's important when you do break the rules to know why those rules are there, but to also have really good reasons for breaking them. Otherwise, don't break them if you don't have a good reason. This is one that's sort of a flashback or a collage. So, you know, she's kind of, this is all inside her head, obviously. So you can use tricks like this where you don't even divide the page. You know, everything sort of just flows, kind of like our dreams. When you go into one weird part of your dream to another weird part, you can't really point to where it changes, right? So you can also do that on the page. This is kind of one example of that. With this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between thought boxes and dialogue bubbles. There are also thought bubbles, right? Where you have instead of the little, you know, attribution triangle to who's talking, you have the little, you know, the smaller circles. And so, why are thought boxes important in comics? Anybody?
That's into a character's head.
Yeah, get inside a character's head, right? But also in a way that's not as personal. And so if something is going on like historically, or you know there's something going on around the character or characters, thought boxes, obviously you have a POV character just like you do in a novel. And so, you know, one of the characters is telling the story, or you have a narrator. But narrators are also characters, right? Charles Dickens is a character in his books. But you basically, you have these thought boxes which kind of help clue the reader in as to what's going on. You know, you can do a lot of the world building. In this case, it's a lot of politics, or, you know, the dangers that are surrounding our elite team of soldiers. And we're in the head of the historian, Marcus, who is the main character. And you have all of this, like I said, you have all this dialogue, all this kind of world building and historical stuff. You turn the page and it's one simple little dialogue, or, thought box. And it says, how could we fail? You know, and you have the juxtaposition of how could we fail with a giant picture of the bomb going off and them failing, right? Alright, so this is my first written and illustrated by graphic novel, Dragon's Gate. It's sort of Lord of the Rings style. This is one of the early sketches I did. There's a dragon, kind of a humanoid Draken race. And this was an early sketch of that. We have the map. Sometimes for fantasy it's fun to have maps, but also map the story out in your mind. You know, how far does it take the characters to get from point A to point B? And then here are some of my character concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit about characters here. With comics, you don't see a lot of pictures like this in the actual comic, but you do see pictures after the comic of the creators kind of, you know, basically coming to the final product of the character. You see a lot of character sketches and early preliminary designs and stuff like that. It's so helpful to get that right before you start writing and illustrating before you start illustrating your comic. Because in comics, you have to draw these people a lot, or those animals or creatures or whatever it is you're doing. In Dragon's Gate, there's 84 pages, and so I had to draw those characters dozens of times. And so you want to get the costume, the hair, the makeup, you want to get that all right before you start. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and change a lot of things on a a lot of pages. So it's really good to get those character designs down before you just start working from the script. So these are some of the finished illustrations from my graphic novel, Dragon's Gate. You can see these are the splash pages. And these are the ones everybody loves, like I said. There's a 2-page spread of the giant battle at the end. Alright, these are some of the color. I've actually played with the idea of doing Dragon's Gate as an illustrated novel as well, just for those same reasons that I mentioned about Blink. But this is page 1 of the graphic novel. This is just a couple examples there. Let's see, is there something? Okay, yeah, let me actually just stop at these two.
So it's all in black and white?
Yeah, Dragon's Gate is black and white. One of the reasons for that is cost. To do a full color comic is much more expensive. Profit's not as high. We all know the difference between a black and white copy and a color copy. But also, I've always sort of favored pencils. I've recently started coloring my work just because that's what I see that audiences kind of like and that's what they want. So I do that. But with Dragon's Gate, it was my first, and I knew my strength was with the pencil. So these are all pencils. But you can see on both of these pages, both of these are the beginning of a different scene. And you'll notice that the first panel is an establishing shot. Has anybody heard that phrase before? And so you do that to orient your reader. You're like, okay, we're on to a new scene. They do the same thing in television and film. Here you have an establishing shot of the city that he's looking over from his balcony. Alright. You have action shots. Sometimes you can have these inlaid panels, where you have a panel inside a panel, where you can kind of zoom in on what's happening. You know, you zoom in on the action, the point of action. This is a character I created for another project called Defender of Lions. This is the line drawing, and then I think I have the color version. I mentioned character concepts, you know, nailing the character concepts before you actually start on your comic. This was a race called the Gorbanes. They look a little bit like monkeys, right? But then they have, you know, Mayan and Inca, a little bit of Aztec influence in there with their armor and clothing. And they obviously stand more upright like humans or orcs. So you can kind of take you know, inspiration from a lot of different areas to build your races and your characters. Here we have the Gorbane King. Armor design kind of inspired by Planet of the Apes, Tim Burton's version with the curly cues and things. But it doesn't look cutesy, you know. Somehow he figured out how to make curly cues formidable. Evil looking. This is the single issue covers I did for Devil's Triangle. And then once all 6 issues were complete, we compiled it into a graphic novel. We wrote each issue with its own story arc. And generally in comics, an issue is 22 pages. More and more now that a lot of people are reading comics digitally with Comixology.com and other readers, you're seeing more kind of deviate from that, you know, lockdown 22 pages. And when I say a comic is 22 pages, generally they're more, but it was because there's advertising space on the hard copies. But now they're sort of venturing out. You'll see more comics that aren't, you know, necessarily 22, but it's a good rule of thumb. If people are forking out the money, they sort of expect at least 22 pages of artwork. But like I said, each individual issue of Devil's Triangle had its own small story arc, but then we had an overarching story arc that was the full graphic novel, where we had the 3-act series. And so we had issues 1 and 2 were Act 1, issues 3 through 5 were Act 2, and then issue 6 was Act 3. So it's important to have an ending in mind and be able to structure the storytelling, you know, on the individual issues, but then also for your overall story. And you'll see that with, you know, film and television as well. If I have any questions at this point, I don't like to just be a talking head up here. If you guys have questions, there's not too many of us, so yeah.
So for laying out pages of comics, do you draw all on one piece of paper and just like make sure that the lines are straight, or do you draw the picture, take a picture of it, and then like set it up on Photoshop? How do you do that? Just set it
That's a
up.
good question. So, like I said, originally I'll take the script and I'll see how many panels, the writer suggests. And that is just a suggestion, by the way. Sometimes writers miss things like, a character will say something and then another character has to react to that. But a lot of times they'll have the action and the reaction as one panel, and sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you need two panels for an action to take place and then a reaction to take place. Somebody will do something and then somebody will react to it. In writing, that's often called scene sequel. And so you have to kind of make adjustments and make place for that. If any of you like Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling does this religiously. All of her books, scene sequel, scene sequel. Something happens, and then the next scene is them reacting to what happened. And then the next scene, something happens, that scene after that, they're reacting to what happened. And so it's good to know about that and as you're laying out your comic pages. But I kind of work all that stuff out in the thumbnail and the comp stage. Otherwise, it's a huge headache to do it in post-production. Because once you've gone in and added all that detail and you've made it pretty, and then you got to go back and make changes, especially layout changes, bad news. So that's why thumbnails and comps are so important, is because you get all of that planning out of the way first when it's not taking up so much time, and then you make it pretty. Here, like I said, this is the opening page of Devil's Triangle, and it's a huge establishing shot. And then you have an establishing shot from a bird's eye view. When you're doing comics, a lot of times you'll have a bunch of people in a room talking, and nobody wants to see the same picture of people talking over and over and over. And so you have to get creative. Let's take the camera and let's glue it to the ceiling, for this shot. Or let's take the camera and let's drop it onto the floor and get a fisheye view of what's happening. So bird's eye view, fisheye view, they're very helpful to kind of break up the monotony and give sort of action to a scene that doesn't necessarily have any action. This is a scene of Gist Miller carving a flute. And then he feels a little gust of cold. Here we have kind of that like I was talking about, where you have the shark far away, medium, closer, about to eat him. And this is where our story jumps the shark. Somebody in my writers group had to make a joke about this. We jump the sharks. Does everybody know what that expression means?
What's his face? The Bonnie. Thank you.
Yeah, elaborate.
The show started suffering so much that they had the farms jump the shark.
Yeah.
To try to keep it.
Try to up the ratings, right?
Yeah.
Backfired. Yeah, Fonz jumped the shark and then nobody watched it again. So basically it's something that happens in a story or in a television show or a film where it's just so bad that nobody can watch the show anymore, you just can't watch. So they had to make that joke. But actually it fits in Devil's Triangle because of what's going on, in the supernatural world around them. And we were obviously aware of that. Yeah, so let's see. Some of these slides I wanted to focus on certain elements. This is, believe it or not, this is an establishing shot. Establishing shots don't always have to be boring. They don't always have to be where nothing's going on. We had two giant ships that had collided, and there's a giant shootout going on, and that's the cliffhanger that we ended issue 1 with. And so that's where our story is. And so with issue 2, to pick up on that scene and carry on, we needed an establishing shot where all of this stuff is happening. And so you take a wide shot, you pull all the way back, and you get it all in there. And so your reader, once they pick up issue 2, they're like, oh wow, look at all this stuff going on right at the beginning. And that's also called a hook, you hook your reader right at the beginning, and so they want to read the rest of it. So it's good to end with cliffhangers and start with a hook. All right, here, she's going crazy. She's getting possessed by a demon, and everybody's standing around her. I thought, what's the most dynamic way that I can show this, right? And so a bird's eye view, I can get everybody on the page, but still have it look dynamic. And you have all this dialogue that's going on as well, and you can see that it flows from left to right, from top to bottom, and it flows quite seamlessly. And so you read through that, and it's not jarring, it doesn't hurt the eyes, you're not confused where to go next. And so that's something to consider. I know the Chinese, Japanese, they read from right to left. Does anybody know? Yeah. I'm not sure if it's all kind of like Koreans. Do they do that as well?
I don't think so.
Okay, just
They
China.
do Arabic.
Yeah. Right. So obviously the Chinese, are the same problem that they have to solve, but it's opposite, right? But for us, it's left to right. Most people read left to right, up to down. And so you have to be aware of that as you're laying out panels. And also leave space on your page for those dialogue bubbles, for the thought boxes, that sort of thing. Are we on time here? Pick this up a little bit. All right, Batman. Who's that kid that doesn't like Batman? He left, right? Good. I do not like Batman. Come on. This artist, let's see, we have Rick Crochet, penciler. This is a scene we've all seen how many times? Yeah, too many. If you got a contract with a comics publisher and they sent you this scene, like I've seen this before, what would you do with it? You'd have to do a different spin on it, obviously. I like what he did here. There's a lot going on this two-page spread, right? But this is sort of thinking outside the box. He's got the bat symbol in the back. We immediately recognize that. We know it's Batman. And so we're instantly interested because we all love Batman. But I want to focus on this page for a second. We all know Batman is this hulky, strong, very intelligent, hyper-intelligent man. With a lot of money, a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of gadgets, and he's almost invincible, right? With his superpowers of wealth and intellect. But beneath all of that, he's this scared little boy whose parents just got shot, right? So I love what this artist did here, showing who Batman is on page 1. I thought it was brilliant. That's just how design can really serve your story. All right. Your question a few minutes ago, you were asking, does it have to be, straight lines, dividing up the page? One of the things I said at the beginning was you don't have to commit yourself to boxes or rectangles. And so I'm going to show some examples of more creative ways of laying out a comic page here. And you can see that it helps. Generally when you have diagonal lines, it adds more of a dynamic feel. There's more action going on. If you show a grandma rocking in her rocking chair and you have a straight on angle, it's just an old woman in a rocking chair. If you tilt the camera a little bit, then there's something a little off. Something's going to happen. Maybe she's a serial killer, I don't know. But something's wrong. And so you tilt the camera, you get these diagonal angles, and all of a sudden, stuff that we're comfortable with isn't quite as comfortable. We all feel good on a cruise ship that's totally horizontal, but once the cruise ship hits a storm, and it starts rocking, we're not so comfortable anymore. And so you can use those same kind of elements when you're laying out your page. This is something I just wanted to show for design's sake. don't think that you have to use every ounce of white on the page and you have to fill every ounce of white on the page. You can get creative with how you lay things out. Even though this isn't an actual comic page, you know, I love the design work here. And so I'm trying to get you guys to think outside the box more and don't just do the Sunday cartoon, you know, box after box sort of thing. I think we're moving into an era where you can experiment a little bit more and you know, try things out that actually are a little more interesting than what we're accustomed to.
So, just a question. When obviously we see a lot of comics that have squares on a white background. Actually, this is totally what I was talking about, asking about. Right? Is it like, how does it affect the comic when we say don't put a panel there at all, and instead the image is on the page itself, and the panels are on top of the image, and maybe the image itself can fade out into white behind those other panels?
Absolutely.
But does that affect
or
how
red.
you're perceiving?
Yeah.
Does that have a specific effect that we want to aim for?
Yeah, it does. I mean, just look at.
Want to use it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, great question. I mean, look at these examples. You know, I could talk about it, but why don't we just look at it? You know, these guys do it brilliantly here. Introduction to Catwoman, introduction to the Riddler. Look at how they use the question marks filling up the background. It's not just a white page behind those panels. We're in the Riddler's world here, right? We know we're going to get to this guy, and it's not going to make us comfortable. Here we have the introduction to Poison Ivy. Does anybody know what this type of illustration is called on the top of her laying next to this tree? The tree doesn't take up everything, right? There's still white background behind it, but we're not inside a circle, we're not inside a square or a box. The image itself is just on top of the white page. I actually incorporated this into some of my comic here. That's called a spot illustration. You can see they put the little white outline around this guy's hand to break it up, which just helps it have more cleaner design. You can see these thought boxes actually break outside the bounds of the panels. This is a good example of pencil, ink, color, but also kind of a comp, and then a finish, and then a pretty. Another example here. So these are, I mean, over here you've basically got stick figures, right? Little dots for eyes and mouths. But you can tell who the characters are enough. Get everybody on the same page. This is just an example of establishing shot, and then also leaving space for dialogue and action. This is a really cool example of thinking outside the box. This is from Fathom, I believe. Look at the shape of these panels. They look like bubbles, right? This whole scene takes place underwater. It's kind of a mixture between bubbles and seaweed, right? Which is perfect. But you can see the placement of the thought boxes here. Still lead your eye. It's still easy to know which one they want us to read first. Great, thank you. So I'll just kind of cruise through these a little bit. Here we have Hawkeye. Great example of good design, good layout. I wanted to show one piece in particular. This one. Alright, generally you limit yourself to about 4 to 7 panels on a page. It's kind of the industry standard. He's got all of these faces, and all they say is, well, that's cool. So why would he do that? Well, it's above and below him shooting his bow and arrow, right? So it's an illustration that time slows down while he's shooting his bow and arrow. Because while he's doing that, she's saying, well, that's cool, you know? And so I thought that was a really brilliant way to show, you know, what actually happens while he's doing that, you know, performing that action. Here we have another splash page, Iron Man. Some cool layouts here. Double page, 2-page spread. Panels on top of panels, characters on top of both. Here we have the characters jumping off the page. invading other panels, a lot of action, a lot of diagonal lines. This is my new comic that I just finished. I just started submitting this week actually, Kamikaze. Here we have an intro to the world, to the characters. Stillwater Badlands. Bad cowboys approach, they have an exchange. It's a gun, there's some action, unexpected. Just gonna cruise through these as we're short for time. When you're introducing characters, it's also important to introduce conflict. And so if you show your characters all arrive on the scene, and they're all hunky-dory, they're good friends, there's no conflict, conflict or suspense really breeds a good story. You'll be hard-pressed to find a really, really good film or a really, really good book that lacks a lot of conflict. I don't know why, but as human beings, we're drawn to conflict, we're drawn to suspense. And so it's important to clue your reader in on what that conflict is right off the bat. And it's also called the inciting incident or the hook. So that's important to remember when you're laying out these comic pages, is what is the conflict and how do I support that conflict with the layout of the page. Alright, so this is my last example. This is what I'm working on right now. In other panels I mentioned that I originally illustrated, I also wrote this, I wrote a Vila. It's a story about this intergalactic transport crew. They basically transport dangerous, wild, alien animals or creatures from zoo to zoo, from planet to planet. And everything that can go wrong transporting these really dangerous animals. And I wrote the first 5 pages and totally finished illustrations and everything. And then realized it was paced too fast. I was introducing these alien creatures, these alien spaceships, and I was doing it all in 5 pages, and I realized the pacing, it was just too quick. So I had to take that 5 pages, redo it all, and spread it out to 7 pages. And so I finished the first 4 of the redo. Also, this character here was green, but she looked too much like Guardians of the Galaxy, so I changed it just to be more original. This is me and my wife actually, but we don't really look like that, obviously. But it was fun to design these hovercrafts. But you can see I used that kind of splash or spot illustration style with this. You know, you have your beginning and your end, and what happens in the middle doesn't necessarily have to jive with the beginning and the end. Here we introduce 5 new characters on 1 page. And this is, at the beginning of your story, people are just getting to know them, right? So it's important to give us those scenes where we kind of get to know their personalities and their styles, each individually. And to flesh them out. Here we have an illustration of them without a background. And I didn't want to just have the same picture twice, right? And so it breaks up and makes it more interesting if we have a spot illustration to juxtapose the sky background. Thirdly. Here we introduce ourselves to a 6th character here, Gidget. Who obviously has webbed fingers and feet. She's a swimmer. She catches fish in her teeth. And, I'm trying to do something new, think outside the box with these characters, give us something we haven't seen before. And so that's my team. So that's a Vila. That'll hopefully come out next year. So if I'm around, check that out. It's going to be awesome. Star Wars meets Jurassic Park. I think we're about out of time. Maybe 1 or 2 questions real quick. You guys have any questions for me? Out of time? All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody.